Good evening or good morning, depending on wherever you are, and greetings from the U.S. Embassy in Kuala Lumpur. I'm Morgan O'Brien, and I'm the spokesman at the U.S. Embassy. Now, because of precautions tied to the COVID-19 pandemic, we're transitioning to virtual programming here at the Embassy. And while this is unfortunate, frankly, I can think of no more timely presentation than the one that we're going to have today, and with the partners that we have, including the EcoHealth Alliance and the organization's president, Dr. Peter Daszak. Now, the United States is a world leader in health and humanitarian assistance, and for decades, the U.S. has been the largest contributor to global health security. And we provide this aid not just because of generosity, but because global pandemics don't know national borders. And by helping other countries improve their public health, we're able to protect Americans at home. Now, for the last 20 years, the U.S. has invested more than $140 billion in health and humanitarian assistance around the world. And that includes more than $1 billion to strengthen the capacity of countries to protect, detect, and respond to existing and emerging infectious disease threats. One of the many organizations we've partnered with on these initiatives is the EcoHealth Alliance, an organization that conducts research on global health, conservation, and international development. And in a moment, Tom Hughes, who's the Malaysian project coordinator, is going to expand on the great work that EHA has done in partnership with the Malaysians here, and now also through U.S. government assistance. As I mentioned earlier today, we're very fortunate to have with us Dr. Peter Daszak, who is the president of EcoHealth Alliance. Dr. Daszak is well known for identifying and predicting the origin and impact of emerging diseases around the globe. This includes the origin of SARS, the drivers of the Nipah virus emergence, discovering the SARS coronavirus, and designing a strategy to identify the number of unknown viruses in wildlife. Now, a fundamental part of his work on disease ecology focuses on the theme that disease outbreaks are not just predictable, but preventable, which is why it's very important that we listen to what he has to say. I'm now honored to turn things over to Tom Hughes, who I mentioned is a senior scientist and the Malaysia project coordinator for the EcoHealth Alliance, and he is going to facilitate today's discussion. With that, Tom, take it away.
Thanks, Morgan. Selamat datang, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be speaking with you all today. I wanted to take this opportunity to talk about the efforts that EcoHealth Alliance have been involved in here in Malaysia with our local partners to better understand how zoonotic viruses like Nipah or SARS-CoV-2 can spill over into livestock and human populations. I have been lucky enough to call Malaysia home since 2005 and manage EcoHealth Alliance projects working closely with our Malaysian Government, university and NGO partners, including Perkhidmatan, the Ministry of Health, the Department of Veterinary Services, Sabah State Health Department, Sabah Wildlife Department, Danau Girang Field Centre, University Malaysia Sabah and University Putra Malaysia to help develop personnel and laboratory capacity and establish sustainable systems for wildlife and livestock disease surveillance. Over the last 10 years, the main focus of this collaboration has been the USAID-funded PREDICT project, part of the Emerging Pandemics Threat Programme, that seeks to discover zoonotic viruses in wildlife before they become human epidemics and identify the factors that drive their emergence, amplification and spread. PREDICT Malaysia has trained over 670 people in the last 10 years across Peninsula, Sabah and Sarawak. Most people received multiple trainings over the 10 years, including PPE use, safe animal sampling, lab techniques and outbreak response training. PREDICT Malaysia conducted concurrent animal-human sampling in 9 Orang Asli villages to better understand how zoonotic viruses spill over and spread in communities with lots of contact with wildlife. We gave talks to over 1,000 Orang Asli villagers at community meetings about zoonosis, the One Health concept, and the risks posed by contacts with wildlife and how to minimize these risks, such as not touching dead animals you find in the forest. PREDICT Malaysia conducted community trainings in Sabah and Peninsula on living safely with bats. Over 800 people attended these trainings. 95 bat books were provided in Malay and in the Dusun language to community leaders and the schools in each community. PREDICT Malaysia has sampled over 1,400 people and nearly 5,000 animals, collecting 50,000 specimens. PREDICT Malaysia helped develop laboratory capacity in Sabah in collaboration with Sabah Wildlife Department and Danau Girang Field Centre, establishing the Wildlife Health, Genetic and Forensic Laboratory. In August 2019, the lab was certified for the 6th year in a row as a BSL-2 biocontainment level laboratory in accordance with internationally recognised standards. Predict Malaysia also helped build lab capacity in Peninsula, the best example being the Molecular Diagnostic Laboratory established in collaboration with Perhilatan at the new National Wildlife Forensic Laboratory. In May 2019, the lab was certified for the 3rd year in a row as a BSL-2 lab. Predict Malaysia has completed over 100,000 tests and has identified 77 novel viruses, including 17 new coronaviruses found in bats and rats, and 30 known viruses. This provides the Malaysian government with actionable data to inform risk mitigation policies at the national and state level. Further characterization of these novel viruses to understand their risk is ongoing. In May 2017, with our partners on Peninsula Malaysia, we started serological biosurveillance for the spillover of henipaviruses and filoviruses at agriculture and hunting human-animal interfaces. This project, funded by the DITRA Biological Threat Reduction Programme, will strengthen capacity for serological surveillance within national labs and characterise henipavirus and filovirus exposure in bats, livestock and people. This project has enhanced capacity within Malaysia to detect known and unknown henipaviruses and filoviruses, conducting active surveillance in wildlife, livestock and people in hunting and agricultural communities has found serological evidence of exposure to henipaviruses and filoviruses in people, macaques and bats. This work increases our ability to detect spillover of important human and livestock pathogens from wildlife reservoirs and develop target strategies to reduce the risk of epidemics. This work helps place the Malaysian government at the forefront of biosurveillance for high consequence viral pathogens. Serology can help us understand viral spillover and inform zoonotic disease surveillance and research programs. EcoHealth Alliance is committed to working with our Malaysian partners to continue training and capacity building efforts, disease surveillance using molecular and serological techniques at high-risk interfaces and in hospital settings, identifying which new pathogens pose a risk to humans, wildlife and livestock, and improving diagnostics. This effort will help us build on our readiness to respond to the next disease X. With that in mind, I would like to hand things over to Dr. Peter Daszak, the President of EcoHealth Alliance and part of the team who in 2005 identified bats as a natural reservoir of SARS-like coronaviruses. Peter is going to talk today about how the SARS-CoV-2 outbreak began and why pandemics will keep happening if we do not change our ways. Please use the chat function on the Facebook Live feed to send me your questions for Peter, and he will answer them after his talk. I want to thank all our Malaysian partners for their continued support. Without you, none of this work would be possible. I also want to thank everyone working tirelessly on the front line controlling the COVID-19 outbreak in Malaysia. Many have been involved with Predict. Please remember, stay at home and break the chain. Peter, over to you in New York.
Thank you very much, Tom. Selamat pagi, everybody. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning, good evening from New York. I'm going to now go to my slideshow and hope this works without problems. Here we go. Can everybody see that okay? Right, so I want to talk about the origins of this current pandemic and really hopefully in the questions and answer, get to answer some of the questions about where this came from. But let's look at the scientific data around pandemics and why they tend to happen, what causes them to emerge. We know from the work we've been doing over the past 20 years that emerging diseases are on the rise. We've known throughout recent history there have been many pandemics in the past, some of them very significant, like the 1918-1919 flu, like the HIV/AIDS pandemic. One thing that is a common theme throughout pandemic history is that these pathogens are usually viruses, they're usually animal origin viruses, and they're caused to emerge by dramatic shifts in the way we live on the planet, either the way we move around the planet through travel and trade, or the way we move into wildlife habitat because we come across pathogens that wildlife carry that then get into our population. We know that some of these outbreaks can be really significant. This is just a graph over the last 2-3 decades of a number of well-known emerging diseases, including SARS. And just look at the size of the economic impact. SARS, for instance, affected only 8,000 people, but cost between $30 and $50 billion to the global economy. And that's because outbreaks nowadays spread through travel and trade. And what we see straight away is that that pathway becomes a high risk for people to move. We close it down and we close down our economies, even marginally with small outbreaks. Nipah virus in Malaysia cost between $500 and $650 million in closing down a trade pathway in pigs to Singapore and the rest of the world. Eventually we adapt, but these shocks are very big. And you'll see on the far right of this graph, there's a large looming dark brown colored circle. That's the current coronavirus outbreak. It dwarfs all other recent outbreaks in economic impact, thought to be in the hundreds of billions of dollars and already wiping off trillions of dollars of value to the stock market. So our organization, EcoHealth Alliance, has been really focused on what can we understand about the process by which pandemics emerge? Can we begin to analyze them scientifically and find common patterns that hold up when we test them with statistical significance? Can we use those patterns to predict things? Can we, it's very unlikely we'll be able to predict exactly what pathogen will emerge next or exactly when and where. But can we say roughly where the next one's most likely to come from? If we know that, we can go to those places and look for them and try and block emergence. Can we understand what's causing these pandemics to rise? If we understand the underlying causes, we can try and reduce the whole problem. Can we identify the pathogens that wildlife have that haven't yet become pandemic, but have a potential in the future too? And that way we can try and develop maybe vaccines against them or block the transmission. And finally, if we can try and predict this, can we then use that to prevent pandemics, prevent the whole process? And how much will that cost and how much will it save in the long term? These are key questions that we're beginning to answer, and it's still early days in this research. So the first question, we know if we look at the trends in emerging diseases over time, that they are rising. Of course, the problem is we're also increasing our surveillance every year. We have more doctors and medics and scientists looking for these diseases. So when you correct for that increase in surveillance, you get a statistically significant rise over time. So yes, emerging diseases are rising over time. They are an increasing threat. And if you look at this graph, you can see that you can project forward a trajectory from this. This is the last 6 decades or so, starting in the 1940s. You'll see in the 1980s, it was an abnormally high peak to the number of new pathogens coming into our human population. And that was driven by HIV/AIDS, which in itself made us susceptible to other new pathogens that emerged. But the trend is upwards, and that block of yellow in the middle of those bar charts there, that's the number of diseases that originate in wildlife. If we look at pandemics, almost every pandemic out there that we've known about has its origin in wildlife. But to some extent, even flu, for instance, we know that some of the genes that go into new pandemic strains of flu evolve in wild birds, get into poultry and into pigs and into people. We know that Ebola starts off probably in bats, gets into primates, into people. Nipah virus started off in bats, got into pigs and into people. There are strong themes underlying this risk. Those wildlife origin, especially viruses, are the big threat, and they're growing significantly as a portion of total emerging diseases, actually exponentially over time. By studying those trends and by correcting for the biases, we've been able to analyze what correlates with the origin of a new pandemic. If we look at about 500 emerging disease events, some of these become pandemics, some fizzle out. They infect a few people and disappear. Nipah virus in Malaysia, for instance, was dealt with. The outbreak was controlled and it's never emerged again in Malaysia. But we know that in India and Bangladesh, it spills over regularly through a different pathway. so that the outbreaks are small but very severe in terms of death rate. But looking at that overall pattern, we can start to say what factors correlate with the origins of those. And what we see are there are really three significant issues. One is human population density. Where people are on the planet, where the most dense populations are, we see a risk of new diseases. We need wildlife diversity. They supply the viruses. They carry viruses that are pretty natural in their populations that don't seem to do much to them. When we make contact, we run the risk of picking them up. So if you have a higher wildlife diversity, like Malaysia with its beautiful wildlife, incredible diversity that brings tourists from around the world, of course, one of the risks is they happen to carry viruses, and there's an increased risk if we make contact. And very importantly, this paper shows that change in the environment, in this case, land use change, this factor called change in the pasture, the amount of forest in an area, if we cut it down, we get an increased risk of an emerging disease. If we increase our urban sprawl, we get an increased risk of an emerging disease. So the hotspots where new pathogens emerge tend to be tropical, where the wildlife diversity is. They tend to be developing countries or middle-income countries, or the new wealthier countries like Malaysia, like China, where there are lots of people interacting with wildlife, and especially around building roads into the forest, increasing livestock production. So by knowing this, we can now target our surveillance to the areas most likely to start a next pandemic. What about the species of wildlife that carry these viruses? Which are the highest risk group that we should be most interested in or concerned about making contact with? Well, if we look at every species where we've had a virus described from it, and we line up, each dot here on this graph is a species, and you can see the types of animals that are shown there, each group of mammals. Mammals are the ones that seem to carry the most pandemic viruses. And what we see is some have many more viruses. The viral richness is the diversity of viruses they carry. Some of them have many more viruses than others. And especially there, if you look at ungulates, cattle, antelopes, those sorts of animals. Now, a red dot means it's domesticated. And of course, if we domesticate an animal over many thousands of years, we're probably going to get exposed to its viruses. We're also going to do more research on them because we're interested in them being healthy and well. So we find more viruses. So again, we have to correct for the bias here, where we've looked at these animals intensely, we're going to find more viruses. If you correct for the amount of effort spent looking for them, we find a different pattern. We now find that bats have the highest proportion of zoonotic viruses. And when we run mathematical models to predict the unknown diversity, they have the most, likely the highest proportion of projected unknown viruses on the planet. And that's very important because we know that some really significant pathogens like Nipah virus, like Ebola, like SARS, and probably SARS coronavirus 2, the virus behind COVID-19, come from bats. So let's look a bit at COVID-19. Let's look back in history 15 years ago to the outbreak of SARS. This is a wet market in Guangdong province, Guangzhou city. It's the index market where the first case of SARS was discovered, the first person to get infected. And, you know, for those of you who've been to wet markets in China and other parts of Southeast Asia, you know that they're places with lots of live animals. They're often sold live to people. They're often kept together in cages with different species. People are there bustling around in crowds, and they're often cut up and sold on directly. And the bits of animals are often thrown on the floor. So it's a perfect place for a virus to spread from one species to another. So wet markets are a risk. And we've known that for a long, long time through H5N1 flu, for instance, that emerged through the poultry markets in China and Hong Kong. And so this market is the origin of SARS. Our work showed that if you go out to those markets and trace the animals that have evidence of coronavirus, bats have a whole group of viruses closely related to SARS. So they're the natural reservoir of SARS. or the viruses from which SARS evolved. Now let's look at COVID-19. We know that most of the first group of cases had some contact with this market, the Huanan seafood market in Wuhan. Now, not all of them did. Some of them, some of the earlier cases, we don't know where they caught their infection. But clearly this market was involved in amplifying the early spread of the virus. We know when we look at the sequence of the virus that the closest known relative is from a bat. So if you look at the red viruses here, this is a phylogenetic tree. You get the genomes of all the viruses, line them up, run them through a computer program, and it tells you how closely they're related. It's like a family tree for viruses. So all of the beta, COVID, Wuhan, WIV 02, 06, 05, they're the human samples of people infected with COVID-19. The closest relative, 96.2% identical on its whole genome, is a bat virus called RATG13 from a Rhinophilus affinis in southwestern Yunnan. Now, we don't know if that's the actual virus. It's probably not. It's quite distant, actually. There are probably many other viruses closer to SARS-2 out there in bats. But what this tells us is it's likely a bat origin virus. Somehow, a bat virus got into people. Once that happened, once we had it amplified in the wet market, and in Wuhan we saw community transmission, it had probably been going on before we detected it, before the Chinese authorities detected it. We then knew that it was going to spread. Now, China did some incredibly bold, severe lockdowns, especially the timing of them around the Lunar New Year, unprecedented. But unfortunately, it wasn't enough to control and contain that outbreak. People had clearly already traveled. And we know that the first case outside China was in Thailand. I think it was on January the 13th. So early January, for every case that was discovered, there were other people who went back to their home countries, Thailand or other parts of Southeast Asia or Europe, and began to spread and were never identified. And this is some work we do with Homeland Security in the US to predict where people will fly to out of every airport on the planet. It also predicts where they'll connect to and continue flights. So we knew early on that the US, for instance, and Europe was at risk of picking up COVID-19, but especially Southeast Asia. And of course, that is exactly what's happened. Like we see with other pandemics, the virus escaped. We tried everything by we, I mean us, humans, tried everything to control this, but it got out. And once the virus gets out and starts to spread, ultimately it becomes really difficult to contain. And right now we're in just response, lockdown, social distancing, trying to reduce the number of people that get infected. As Tom said, flattening the curve as much as we can. So our hospitals don't get overwhelmed and we reduce the death rate, the unnecessary death rate from this pretty horrible disease. Now, what's really interesting is if we look back over time and try and remember what life was like back in March, this is the daily number of confirmed coronavirus cases. The yellow line at the top is China, the sort of orange line. And you'll see a blip. And look at the date signal for that, around February the 10th. This is where China changed the case definition so they included everybody who was suspected, basically, and they made it easier to diagnose without a test. It increased the number of cases that they reported. And back in March the 12th, this was a terrible disease. 80,000 people were getting infected here. And we knew that there were cases at the bottom on the yellow line, other countries, and we knew cases were beginning to spread elsewhere. But now look at the situation. This is today, tonight. I got these data tonight from the Johns Hopkins website. You can just about see the blip on February the 10th. If you can see my cursor, it's right there. This is where we are now. We're in a completely different situation. China took the brunt of this outbreak. It spread rapidly, and they actually contained it in the end. But unfortunately, for the rest of the world, we're now having to take the brunt of it. And this is what we're dealing with every day. Let's look at Malaysia. You can see, actually, I think Malaysia, you did an amazing job of avoiding this outbreak for as long as possible. We knew it was in Thailand in January. We knew there was likely community spread, but you managed to have a really low number of cases, 0 cases, and eventually a few cases. But once it starts to transmit within the community, we're always trying to catch up with that spread. So you're, like the US, you're in the almost exponential rise of an outbreak, looking for this daily case rate to drop so that you can start to see the curve flatten and plateau and then drop. It will happen if we listen to the advice, stay inside as much as possible, keep our distance, wear masks, whatever we've got to avoid infection when we go out in public. Now, what can we do about this? You know, one of the things that I've shown you already is that pandemics are emerging because of our global footprint. We know the likely origins, but these are big areas on the planet. We can't completely control this. So what can we do to better reduce the risk of future pandemics? And there will be more. We expect there will be more coronavirus outbreaks too. Well, we started this program called Predict, funded through USAID. We have other funding through Department of Defense in the US, through the NIH, NIAID, and we started looking in these hotspots at wildlife for new viruses that could potentially become pandemic. We work with communities in these hotspots to understand the risk behaviors that happen every day that can start a pandemic spread, and work with them to try and reduce that risk. We build clinics and labs with you. We partner with an incredibly diverse group of universities, government agencies, and the private sector in every country we work in. And we're led by you, local scientists who lead the way in your region, in your country, and show us how we can best do this work. And we bring our skill set in ecology and in looking for these viruses and share with you and try and learn. And what have we done with this? Well, this is how we targeted our work. We couldn't do everything, but we focused first on bats because we knew they were the highest risk group. Secondly, on rodents because they carry pathogens that are high risk. And primates. We all know HIV originated in chimpanzees from similar viruses they carry. So a close relative of ours is likely to carry viruses that can infect us. We work on human behavior. We work with communities. We ask permission to work with them to understand their risk and give them feedback on the risk of catching new infections and hope that that helps change behavior. And we've worked in over 30 countries with this approach, including China. I just want to show you some of the results from China. We sampled now probably more like 15,000 bats across China. We rapidly found that some areas had really high-risk viruses in them. This is a part of Yunnan province in southwest China, about an hour's drive south of Kunming. It's a beautiful part of the world, but it's, 1 hour away, 2 hours from a city with over 6 million people, even though it's very rural. This is a very innocent-looking cave somewhere in southwest Yunnan. It turns out that this cave carries bats, a large population of bats, and they have viruses that are incredibly close to SARS. Effectively, every genetic element of the original SARS coronavirus is present in bats in that one cave. So that's the sort of risk we're dealing with. We work with local communities who live near these caves. We ask them about their relationship with wildlife, how often they eat wildlife, hunt it. We ask them why and how much they pay and if there's an alternative. And then we take samples. We test them, we in China, the labs we collaborate with test them. We give the results back to them. We give them TB tests. We look at their blood pressure. But we also look for any evidence of being exposed to viruses. And we tested these people in Yunnan province for antibodies against bat coronaviruses. Surprisingly, we found up to 3% of people in those communities, and this triangle is where that community is. 3% of people had antibodies to bat coronaviruses. And that tells us that there's this continuous spilling over of these viruses every year across the whole region, because the bats that carry them live across that whole region, including Malaysia. And we've done similar work in Malaysia. Malaysian communities have less risk. There's less diversity of that high-risk group of viruses, but there may be others that we don't really understand yet. So this is important work, I think. And it tells us that between 1 to 7 million people a year are exposed to bat coronaviruses. That's a lot of people. Even if we completely remove the wildlife trade, we'd still have that level of exposure to new pandemics. So we need to work with those communities to understand that risk better and try and mitigate that risk. And that's really the next step of what we're trying to do. We found hundreds of sequences of bat coronaviruses related to SARS, related to SARS coronavirus 2. We found new diseases that kill pigs, that can also infect human cells. And we found the closest relative of SARS. So this is a clear and present danger. And we didn't just do the science, we also made the point repeatedly in papers, to the press, to the media, that these bat coronaviruses in China and across Southeast Asia, and probably across the world, are a high risk for future pandemic emergence. I became a member of the WHO, World Health Organization, R&D blueprint to try and come up with a list every year of what the highest risk pathogens are that could affect us globally, for which we don't have vaccines and drugs. So funding can come in and design those vaccines and drugs. We put SARS on the list. We put SARS-related coronaviruses on the list. We put a new phrase called disease X on the list. X being the unknown diseases where we don't have a platform for vaccines or drugs yet. So to get the idea of, we really need to think differently about pandemics. So what can we do? Well, we are doing some of these things already. As Tom said, we have a communication campaign. We actually began this in West Africa after Ebola, because Ebola is a bat origin virus, probably. So we have this document, this is English, called Living Safely with Bats. We've got another one called Living Safely with Wildlife. We start off by explaining that bats are extremely useful. They perform services for us for free. They get rid of insects, and fruit-eating bats pollinate important crops. Now, important, yes, and I'm talking here about, for instance, durian. Important, especially in Malaysia. The king of fruit is pollinated by bats. Every time I come to Malaysia, I've been to Malaysia maybe 20 times, I try durian every time. I am a committed person who does not like the taste of durian, but I will always try it. I reassure you on that. So this is how important bats are. So we start off with that. Wildlife are important. Don't just kill them thinking you'll get rid of the virus. It won't work anyway. We talk about how to avoid getting infected. If you find fruit on the floor that's been partially eaten, don't pick it up. It's not free food. It's a potential virus reservoir. Don't let your animals feed under bat colonies. If you find a dead bat, how do you dispose of it? And if bats live in your house and you think that's a risk, how do you reduce the risk of getting contaminated by bat feces, which is the way these viruses get from bats to people? So that's one strategy. Another strategy to control future pandemics is to say, if the underlying driver of many of these is land use change, and by that I'm talking about deforestation, essentially in Malaysia and Indonesia, and in particular for palm oil, we've shown clearly that palm oil, the clearing of land for palm oil brings in new diseases, including zoonotic malaria, and it causes a long-term health impacts on communities. Of course, it's highly profitable, and local communities benefit from the profits from palm oil, especially if they're community-owned plantations, privately owned plantations, and in the initial sale of the land. But what we've been able to show is, if you look at, especially in Borneo and Sabah, where we've done a lot of work, we're losing tropical forests at incredible rates. And we're losing the animals that go with those forests, the incredible diversity. We therefore are losing economic income from ecotourists. And that needs to go into the equation about which patch of forest we develop for palm oil, for instance. We also have malaria and other diseases that emerge in these monocultures of palm oil. And the workers that go in there don't have really adequate healthcare to deal with them. So the cost of those outbreaks goes on for decades after the palm oil plantation's built. You, the taxpayers, pay for that, while the private companies make the profit off palm oil. So we're trying to make the connection between the profit and the cost of health, so we can talk to the governments around the world who are making decisions on land use and the private sector. We actually work with palm oil producers in Malaysia and plantation owners that are just incredible and allow us to work on their lands, even though they know that our message might not be great for them. They're trying to do something. They're building clinics for their workers. They're looking at whether their workers go out and hunt animals. So there are some positive things we can do around that. And this is something that EcoHealth Alliance is committed to here in Malaysia, in Southeast Asia, but also in Africa, where we're working with Johnson & Johnson and in Liberia on similar issues, and now in Latin America. Finally, we also think, and you've heard a lot about this with COVID-19, there is clear evidence that the wildlife trade was involved in the initial outbreak. Whether it's the exact origin is not sure. It may have been somebody getting infected by a bat out in a farm or out in rural China, but then went to a market and spread it among themselves. It may be an animal other than a bat that got infected in a farm, maybe a civet or a bamboo rat that then came into the market and spread the virus. But it's clear that wet markets are a risk of pandemics. And the wildlife trade itself is a risk. And it's a risk not just for pandemics, it's also a conservation threat. And these are Pteropus flying foxes, giant fruit bats in Sulawesi, Indonesia, in a local market, and people eat them. They're apparently delicious. People in Malaysia sometimes eat them too. And they're hunted across their range, but their populations are dropping. And as they're hunted, people are exposed to blood, feces, and other elements that allow the viruses to get into them. So this is a risk, and we need to deal with it. I don't think it needs to be a simple ban. People are calling for a ban on the wildlife trade. I don't think that's going to work, especially in a place like China, where you've got 5,000 years of culture behind those traditional meals. I think we need to work with people who do this, understand why, what are their incentives, give them alternatives, let them tell us what alternatives there are, and then work with the governments to design those strategies. With some legislation and encouragement, we can make that trade safer, healthier for them and for the rest of the planet. And that's really our goal. So at that point, I want to just, again, thank our amazing collaborators with PREDICT and our NIH work and our other funding. We work in now over 40 countries. It's hundreds of partners at this point. I want to thank the PREDICT Consortium, led by UC Davis, including WCS, Smithsonian, and many others. And for the work in China, especially the Wuhan Institute of Virology, led by Chengli Shi and Peng Zhu, who are brilliant virologists and have been incredibly stressed and under a lot of pressure by this outbreak. And we're the first, actually, to describe the virus within 2 weeks of finding it. In Malaysia, I'd like to thank our amazing PREDICT partners in Peninsular Malaysia, Perhilatan DVS, VRI, Ministry of Health, National Public Health Lab, UPM, FVM, also in Sabah, BCI, Sabah Wildlife Department, Sabah State Health Department, UMS, Danang Garang, Kota Kinabalu Public Health Lab, and Queen Elizabeth Hospital 1. You have been our partners for a long time, many of you, for nearly 20 years or more. We really value that. We appreciate you allowing us to work with your staff in your country, and it has been a real joy. Malaysia is my favorite country on the planet, other than the one I live in and the one I'm from. And part of me is always there every day. So thank you very much, Terima kasih, and I look forward to questions in due course. Oh, one last thing I want to show you. We do have a petition. If you'd like to write down the URL here, HTTP, this one, whoops. This is to support the medical professionals now of the world. When we wrote this, the virus was only in China, but now globally, and also to fight back at some of the conspiracy theories that have emerged. But please feel free to read it. If you agree, sign it. We have nearly 20,000 people who have. So thanks very much. I'm now going to hand back and await your questions. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Peter. Well, we've got lots of great questions coming in. I think the first one, people are interested to know, Peter, how EcoHealth Alliance's collaboration in Malaysia began. I know it started a few years before I started working with you, so perhaps you'd like to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it was actually straight after Nipah virus, the Nipah virus outbreak, which was a big event globally. I mean, I heard about it. I was working at CDC. I was just there for a few months, but I was working on the samples coming from Malaysia to try and identify the virus. And I got to know the people in CDC who were working with VRI and Ministry of Health and many others on the outbreak up in Ipoh and Sungai Nipah. A horrible disease, a very high case fatality. Nearly 40% of the people that got infected died of brain infection. I met survivors the first time I came, and that made a big impression on me. These diseases are horrific. Malaysia was, led the world in how you dealt with that. You invited in foreigners. You struggled, like every country does initially, to work out what the virus is. It's a new virus. They often hide. They look like other ones, but after a while, you worked out what it was. You invited in foreigners from CDC, CSIRO, and University of Queensland, John Mackenzie, Hume Field, and we carried on that work. And we worked on Malaysia with many people at VRI for many years, and just some fantastic science that came out of it.
Thanks, Peter. And it's great to see how the collaboration has grown from that initial work back in 2003 to the range of projects that our Malaysian government partners are involved in today. So another question, Peter, that we're getting from a lot of people is why don't bats get sick with these coronaviruses? Yeah,
it's a tough question. I mean, I think if you think about, humans carry viruses too. We have the common cold or a cold sore, herpes. It doesn't really cause much of an irritating, it's a little bit annoying. The common cold makes you feel a bit ill for a few days, but you still go to work, you still get about your business. And bats do have, from some of the diseases they carry, some of the viruses they carry, they do have very, very mild disease. In Marburg virus, for instance, and maybe in others, we don't really know very well. Bats can't tell us if they're sick. We have to find them, infect them, and see in the lab if they get sick. And those experiments are very hard to do. But anyway, we do know that bats carry lots of viruses and can often live with many, many more viruses in their body than we would. And that may be to do with the way they live. They are the only mammal known to fly independently. And it's thought that the stress, the oxidative stress of flying, it's like running a sprint for hours on end, and it really takes it out of the body. Their immune system responds to that and would actually cause problems if they let that happen. So they dampen down their immune system. We've shown that in the lab. And that may be why they can live with these viruses a lot easier than we can.
So another question we're getting in is about the number of viruses still left to be discovered. People have seen the figure of over 1 million, I think it's 1.27 million viruses that are still out there to be discovered. How do we know there is 1.27 million viruses out there still to be discovered?
Yeah, I mean, this is not an easy thing to calculate. And, this was a dream of mine to be able to do that. And we know that estimate is not very accurate for sure, but it's the best we can do. Now, the way we discovered a way to do this is we started sampling bats, actually, and fruit bats, Pteropus, and we repeatedly sampled them. We got about 2,000 fruit bats in Bangladesh, and we did viral assays on them that discovered new viruses. And what we found is, early on, in the first few samples, we found lots of new viruses. And then after a while, we started seeing the same viruses. the discovery curve starts to slope, just like an epidemic curve does. And the shape of that slope and the rate of rediscovery of viruses you know versus new ones you find allows you to predict the unknown amount that they carry based on the way that curve flattens. You're basically predicting the final place where we found all of the viruses. And we extrapolate from a couple of species to all mammals. Mammals are the highest risk group for new pathogens, new emerging diseases. We include water birds just for influenza viruses, which we know are high risk. And we have an estimate that's rough with lots of confidence bounds around it, but tells us roughly how many out there. We estimate 1.7 million. Now, it may be 10 million, it may be 100,000. But the point about this is it's a manageable number. We can discover those given modern technology, sequencing, and the availability of labs. The hard part is to go out and find the wild animals and sample them, which we know we can do. So we actually know how much it would cost to go and do that work. And we are planning to start work on that. And we have a new organization called the Global Virome Project. And we're raising funds right now to go out and do that. And by the way, some countries are already involved. China and Thailand are interested in doing that work already.
So we've had another question, which is, do you think things will ever go back to normal? And how long will it be until we have business as usual? And I would add to that, is business as usual where we want to be going?
Yeah, good point, Tom. Look, I absolutely feel everybody's pain. I've now been at home for 3 weeks, maybe 4 weeks. I travel all the time, but this year I don't. I'm sat at home in front of my computer all the time. My children are here. We're all locked down. People have lost their jobs. Some people are in a lot worse state than I am. They've lost their jobs. We all know someone who's been infected, someone who's died. Look, this is a terrible outbreak. The point right now is if we loosen up too early, the outbreak will spike and it will overwhelm our hospitals. We saw what happened in Italy, where the death rate climbed and climbed and climbed. We cannot do that. It's just not worth it. The economic loss is huge. The impact on our welfare, our well-being is huge. I think that we're going to be locked down, most countries, probably for the most part of the summer. Here in the US, probably. I think that the whole of the summer of 2020, at least, up until August, and most of the autumn will be severely disrupted, where we gradually allow some people to come back to work. China is doing this now, but with severe restrictions where you have to have a passport, essentially, where you're tested everywhere you go in terms of temperature, where you're given a green, yellow, or red code. If you're in red code, you go into government lockdown, not in your home. Those measures will work, but they're very hard. So I think this year, 2020, will be a tough year. Now, going back to business as usual, Tom's right. We cannot go back to business as usual. I think some things will change for the good. I think what we're doing right now by video conference, we now know that this technology works, and we can, to some extent, work for 20, 30% of our time remotely. That will reduce a lot of the stress and pressure of life and be beneficial to the economy. But there are other things that are going to be tough. I mean, if we go back to having an unprecedented growth in travel and trade and the wildlife trade, livestock production, we're going to continue to see pandemics. So I think we do need to remember this outbreak and change what we do as our business as usual.
So on that note, Peter, several people have asked whether you think wet markets will now be better regulated. And you already touched on why you don't think they should be banned. And maybe you could talk a little bit more about that as well.
Yeah, we're a conservation organization. I'm a conservationist. And when I go to a wet market, it makes me uncomfortable. I'm from England where we don't have those. But we eat animals and we kill them. And that's an ugly thing too. This is a tradition that to the Western mind is shocking. And we hear a lot of that in some of the discussion around it. The call for the ban is easy for someone to say in Europe or US that doesn't have wet markets as part of their culture. I feel more sensitive about it. I think that people in China, this is tradition. There's a reason for it. I think that it will eventually go, but it may take 2 or 3 decades. I think the pressure is on. I think the government will tighten the laws and enforce the laws better. But they understand. China understands that you can't enforce that so dramatically on a whole swathe of your country where there's 5,000 years of behavior and culture behind that. People need alternatives as well. If we're going to say to people, you can't eat wildlife, well, what is the alternative? Are we going to grow more livestock? That has a risk of pandemics too. Things need to be done in a safer way. Then we need to reduce our footprint. We need to have smarter economic growth because pandemics are simply a risk. Every other industry we have out there where there's a risk factor involved, we deal with it, we insure against it, but we don't connect the pandemics to the underlying cause, and that's where we go wrong. Once we start to do that, once we realize the economic impact of doing that for the good, I think we will change.
So I think some of our audience is looking for some clarification on how zoonotic viruses spread from species. Do viruses spill over into people just through consuming wildlife? So maybe you could talk a little bit more about that, a little bit more about other zoonotic viruses that, things like malaria and dengue that we are very familiar with here in Malaysia are also zoonotic viruses.
Well, I mean, no, it's not just from eating wildlife. And in fact, the act of eating a cooked animal is not that risky. What really is the risky part of the wildlife trade is being with a live animal that can bite you or scratch you or getting exposed to its feces or blood when you cut it up. That, hunting, butchering, trading animals is higher risk. And so having them live in a market is high risk. But, being outside in the countryside, we're exposed to wildlife. I visited Gomentong Cave many, many times. The people who work in the cave are exposed to bat feces and urine. So there's a risk to that. Here in the US, when I walk in the hills here, I get bitten by ticks, which carry Lyme disease. My wife has been infected with that. I've been bitten by ticks many times. So we're all exposed to this. And I think we understand there are many, many different ways. Malaria that we see in Malaysia is zoonotic. It comes from primates, non-human primates, apes. And that's a risk too. And that's transmitted through the mosquito bites. So is dengue. So there are many, many different ways that viruses get spread around and other diseases. And of course, one thing we know, they evolve at a very fast rate and their life cycle is much quicker than ours. So they mutate rapidly and shift. They're very good at getting from one species to another. They can't always do that, but there are so many viruses out there spilling over so often that eventually we pick up one that does.
So we're also getting some questions, Peter, about, we've known about SARS since 1998, 1999. Why is it with the SARS coronavirus 2 that we know so little about it? Why are we not able to use the vaccines that we have for SARS to help us today? Why do we still not understand how SARS coronavirus 2 is spreading and who's most susceptible to it?
Yeah, it's a shame, really. I mean, SARS was a wake-up call, really. It was global, even though it was only affected 8,000 people or so. We had a case in New York, I remember. Someone flew into an airport, then changed planes and flew off. Canada got quite a few cases. Singapore was hit pretty bad. The economy dropped. It was a big impact. Now, there were efforts to design vaccines against SARS. But I think what happened is SARS disappeared. The outbreak ended. We all thought it had gone forever. And what drug company is going to spend millions of dollars trying to get vaccines and drugs through clinical trials when there's nobody out there that has the disease? So that's the problem. That's the error we made. And I think that we can correct that. I think that, SARS coronavirus 2 is slightly different. It's not the same virus. But we do know now that there are a few hundred others out there. Now, if we're going to design vaccines against one pathogen, SARS, and then another one pops up that's more lethal or that's lethal in a different virus that the vaccine doesn't work for, we need to change the way we do things. So I'm calling for, and many other people are, a program to design a universal coronavirus vaccine, a vaccine that works against SARS, SARS-2, all the other viruses that we've discovered that are similar, and maybe even MERS, so it goes right across the whole group if that's possible. Work like that is happening right now for flu. There is a program to design a universal flu vaccine, so you only need one vaccine for all the strains, so that you're always protected against the next strain that comes along. It's going to be imperfect, it's going to take time, it's going to cost money, but one thing's for sure, these viruses are evolving all the time. We will find new ones, and if there are 1.7 million or more out there, let's start working on that strategy as well.
So we have an excellent question here, which is, do you think the COVID-19 will switch the narrative around zoonosis and its relationship with land use change? And so, that we'll start to see the mainstreaming of health biodiversity considerations into development planning.
I really hope so. We're already seeing what I think is really refreshing, a lot of big conservation organizations talking about pandemics now, whereas even 6 months ago, it wasn't on their agenda for most of them. But that's great. And it's really to conservation groups' central goal of preserving biodiversity when you see that the wildlife trade is involved in that. We know the wildlife trade is a huge risk to biodiversity. We know that deforestation is the biggest single threat to biodiversity, to vertebrate biodiversity right now. More than climate change, more than the wildlife trade. And deforestation is the one factor in environmental change that comes out in our global analysis as a globally significant driver. So I'm going to be constantly talking about it for the rest of my life. All of our staff we're going to be working on it, designing programs. We're already working with companies that are part of that issue, that buy products that come from deforestation. We're working with palm oil plantations. Companies want to do this better as well. So I do think there's an opportunity now. Let's all get involved and let's make, being a healthy human and a healthy planet one and the same. Our ecological footprint is what drives this, and that's a good thing. If we know what drives it and it's us, we have the power to change it. So let's get out there and start changing it.
So I think maybe we've got time for 2 more questions. Several people are asking, obviously we haven't yet proven conclusively that SARS coronavirus 2, what bat it's come from, and we still don't fully understand how this spillover event happened, whether another animal was involved as an intermediary host, and there's been various papers and speculation about what that animal might be. The question that I have is how do we stop people overreacting and going off and killing bats and killing pangolins and other animals that have been linked to this outbreak, because won't that lead to increased risks of spillover?
Yeah, it's a good question. I know that after Nipah virus, we also heard a lot of people talking about that, and I don't think that happened in Malaysia. I saw no evidence of that, of a pushback against bats. And really the way that we need to talk about this is that bats are essential for our well-being. People don't like bats, that's clear. They kind of flit around. I don't have much hair, so they don't get caught in my hair, but the myth is if you go near bats, they'll fly in your hair and get caught and bite you. We know there are vampire bats, but that's just 2 or 3 or 4 species. And the vast majority of bats are out there in the environment doing what they do best, eating insects that can hurt us, that can hurt our crops, pollinating trees that lead to fruit that we love. Mango, durian, mangosteen, my favorite fruit. For the people that drink, tequila is a favorite drink here in the US and Mexico. It's pollinated by bats. Bats pollinate agave, which is used to make tequila. They're very useful animals. And the same goes for many, many other species. It's one argument we can use. We can use other arguments too. Animals are beautiful. Don't kill them. Leave them alone. The key argument above all is that there is one animal out of this whole diversity on the planet that we can alter the behavior of and control to stop pandemics dead in their tracks. And that's us, the human. We are the hand behind these pandemics. If bats are out there in the forest and we don't go near them, we don't hunt them, we don't eat them, we don't go in their caves, we don't get exposed to them, we will not catch their viruses. So we can control that. And again, bring it back to us and look at our own behavior.
Brilliant. And finally, Peter, what do you think we need to do next as a global community to prevent this kind of thing from happening again?
Well, I think the first thing we've got to do is understand that the anatomy of pandemics, that this isn't just a one-off act of God. This is caused by something that we're doing every day, that it's not just a one-off. There are many, many others in the past, and there will be many more in the future if we continue business as usual. So understanding that that is a real existential threat. Pandemics happen rarely, every few years. We get spillovers of new diseases multiple times a year, but the big events are rare enough that we kind of forget after they happen. This one, you think at the time, we'll never forget this. But in 20 years, it's just a part of old ancient history. And we need to not do that. We need to remember that there are more coming. We depend on our globalized travel and trade more and more every year. Pandemics exploit that. Viruses exploit that travel network to spread. They will emerge quicker. We've shown that. They will move and spread faster around the planet. SARS took 2 to 3 months to get out of China. SARS-2, COVID-19, took 2 weeks. The next one might take 2 days. It could emerge anywhere on the planet, including Europe and North America. We're not immune from that. The impact will be greater because of our reliance on global trade. The impact on us, mortality, will be higher because our populations are more connected. And look at the disruption they cause. So let's remember that. That's the first thing and the main thing. Let's design these strategies to look at pandemics as a public health threat. If I go to the doctor because I'm overweight and I've got diabetes and all I do is eat cheeseburgers and sit around my house, the doctor doesn't say to me, you know, you're going to have a heart attack very soon, but don't worry. When you do, I'll give you a pill and you'll get better. The doctor says, do some exercise, stop eating bad food, and don't have a heart attack. That's what we need to do with pandemics. Let's not just sit around and wait for the next one and hope we get a vaccine quickly. That's not happening. Let's get ahead of it. Let's do some prevention. Let's work with the underlying causes, reduce the risk, and stop these pandemics. We're living in a pandemic era. Let's end that era and move beyond it. Look back on this period in time and think, wow, we really did get a grip of this problem, not just one disease, COVID-19, but all of the new pandemics, and stop that whole process. I think that's something we can do. I'm very optimistic about it, and I will continue saying that every day until it stops. I hope you'll join me. Cheers.
Thank you very much, Peter. So I'll now hand things back to Morgan at the US Embassy.
Thank you very much, Dr. Daszak and Tom. That was wonderful, and we couldn't be happier with our first virtual program. Well, I guess we could be happier if we had an actual program and we had you all here in one room. But it was awesome to get a better understanding of how we got to this current situation and what we need to do and some of the steps we need to take to address this in the future and prevent future outbreaks along these lines. The expertise was wonderful. I'm going to make sure that we post this on our Facebook page for future sharing, and we invite you to continue to have the discussion, keep the discussion going. If you have any questions, feel free to add those to the comment section, and we'll work to get good answers for you there. Again, thank you everybody for your time this morning, for joining us, and stay tuned for future programming along these lines as we continue to produce virtual programming. Thank you very much to the EcoHealth Alliance, and we'll see you all real soon.
Thank you very much. Jumpa lagi.
Jumpa lagi, everyone.
Jumpa lagi. Selamat berhujung minggu.